May 25, 1941, North Atlantic, 500 nautical miles south of Cape Farewell, Greenland. The young midshipman's hand trembled as he gripped the periscope handles, not from fear of the enemy above, but from what he had just heard echo through the steel hull of U-557. A metallic ping, sharp and unnatural, had struck the submarine's hull and reverberated through every compartment. Fritz zur See, Herbert Vera would later write in his private journal, discovered decades after the war. The sound was like nothing we had trained for. It rang through our boat like a church bell announcing our funeral. The British had found them beneath the waves. For 3 years, German U-boat crews had operated with near impunity, believing the ocean depths provided sanctuary from enemy detection. Now that illusion had been shattered in a single haunting sound. Commander Klaus Richter stared at the sonar readouts, disbelief etched into his face. The crew had been trained for depth charges, aircraft attacks, and enemy ships visible above the waterline. But this was different. The metallic ping was methodical, almost purposeful. A sound that suggested the unseen enemy knew their every movement. A predator listening in the darkness. Whispers spread through the vessel's narrow corridors. Men who had laughed off minor scrapes with the Royal Navy now gripped railings, faces pale under the flickering red lights of the control room. Every creak of metal, every bubble in the water seemed amplified. A threat waiting to strike. For the first time, the crew realized the Atlantic was no longer a safe hunting ground. The ocean itself, once a shield, had become an open field under the enemy's gaze. Hours passed in tense silence, punctuated by the recurring mechanical ping. Each echo drove the point home. Stealth was no longer absolute. The German submariners were no longer masters of the deep. Somewhere out there, above and beyond the waves, the Allies had devised a technology that could pierce their sanctuary, and the deadly game of cat and mouse beneath the North Atlantic had changed forever. The illusion of underwater invincibility. By mid-1941, the German Kriegsmarine had grown confident in its U-boat fleet. Submarines prowled the Atlantic in deadly wolf packs, cutting supply lines to Britain, sinking cargo ships with alarming efficiency. Crews operated under the assumption that the vast ocean was their shield, that no surface vessel, aircraft, or device could detect them beneath the waves. Every U-boat captain was taught to respect depth charges and naval patrols, but the idea that sound could betray their presence had never been seriously considered. Until that metallic ping, reverberating through the hull of U-557, shattered their assumptions. In the cramped steel corridors of a U-boat, silence is as vital as air. Every sound, from the hum of the diesel engines to the drip of condensation, is analyzed for danger. So when an unnatural ping penetrated that environment, it was not merely noticed, it demanded attention. The crew of U-557 froze. For weeks they had sailed undisturbed through the North Atlantic, trusting the ocean to cloak them from enemy eyes. Now, an invisible adversary had announced its presence, as if to declare, "You are being watched." Technicians on board attempted to rationalize the sound. Perhaps it was a distant ship sonar echo, or a natural phenomenon bouncing off underwater thermoclines. But the ping was precise, regular, almost mechanical. It resonated in patterns too consistent to be coincidence. Commander Klaus Richter barked orders to adjust depth and change heading. Yet every maneuver seemed to provoke the same haunting sound. Panic subtly crept into the minds of even the most experienced crewmen. Conversations became whispers. Each crew member questioned the reliability of their instruments and the supposed safety of the deep. Meanwhile, German naval intelligence began to take notice. Reports of unexplained U-boat losses were increasing, often attributed to mines or aircraft patrols. But some officers reading logs like that of Fritz zur See Herbert Vera noted a disturbing pattern. Submarines were being attacked without visible cause. The thought gnawed at the command structure. Could the Allies have developed a method to detect them while submerged? It was a terrifying proposition. The U-boat's power had always rested on invisibility. If that invisibility could be pierced, the very foundation of German naval strategy was at risk. For the young midshipmen and seasoned sailors alike, the psychological impact was immediate. Trust in the familiar surroundings of their submarine eroded. The once reassuring metallic hum of machinery now amplified the fear of exposure. Every ping was interpreted as a personal warning, a harbinger of destruction. Sleep became impossible. Routine patrols transformed into exercises in hypervigilance. Submariners knew that if the Allies could hear them, every dive, every evasive maneuver, every hunting tactic would be compromised. The Atlantic was no longer a playground of stealth. It had become a hunting ground where the hunter could strike unseen and the prey could no longer hide. This revelation set in motion a cascade of changes. German engineers and strategists began to investigate countermeasures, experimenting with sound-dampening technologies, irregular routes, and deeper dives. Crews were trained to interpret even the faintest echo, to anticipate the presence of sonar operators miles away. Despite these efforts, the morale hit was profound. Submariners who once celebrated their freedom beneath the waves now faced the unsettling truth. The ocean, which had been their sanctuary for 3 years, was no longer a place where they could operate without fear. The metallic ping of May 25, 1941, would echo through naval history as the sound that first shattered the myth of underwater invincibility. First encounters. The silent hunter revealed as the months of 1941 wore on. Reports from U-boat patrols began to paint a grim picture. The metallic ping that had first unnerved U-557 was no isolated incident. It was becoming a recurring phenomenon across the North Atlantic. German commanders were initially skeptical, attributing the sounds to misinterpreted natural echoes or inexperienced sonar operators on Allied ships. But as more logs were examined, a chilling reality emerged. The Allies had developed a technology that could detect submerged submarines with alarming accuracy. On a moonless night in October, U-96, patrolling west of Ireland, experienced its first clear encounter with Allied sonar. The crew was mid-hunt, plotting a course toward a slow-moving convoy. Lieutenant Hans Weber manned the periscope, scanning the distant horizon, unaware of the invisible threat beneath the waves. Suddenly, the echoing ping returned, rhythmic and precise. Unlike the random sounds of underwater terrain, this was deliberate. The sonar's pulse had found them. The sonar operator's skill was evident. The U-boat was being mapped in 3 dimensions, its position known without the crew even realizing it. Panic rippled through the vessel. Men adjusted ballast tanks, altered depth, and tried evasive maneuvers. Yet the sound continued, unwavering. Inside the tight steel hull of the submarine, tension was palpable. The engine's vibration, the metallic groan of the hull, and the subtle shuffling of crew feet became magnified against the deafening silence of the ocean. Orders were barked sharply. Officers checked gauges obsessively. Every action seemed futile. The crew quickly realized that they were being hunted by something they could not see, something that had effectively removed the U-boat's greatest advantage: invisibility. Previously, German submarines relied on the ocean itself to shield them, trusting that no enemy could follow them beneath the surface. That illusion had been shattered. The Allied sonar had not only detected the U-boat, but had begun to dictate its movements. Depth charges were now planned with precise coordinates, forcing submarines into defensive positions. Commanders attempted new tactics: zigzagging routes, silent running, and deeper dives. But each adaptation was a reaction, a concession to technology they did not yet fully understand. Even the simplest patrols now felt like walking into a trap, as if the ocean had become a chessboard, and the Allies were always one step ahead. Psychologically, the impact on crews was severe. Submariners were trained for depth charge attacks and surface engagements, but sonar was intangible. They could not see it, could not feel it directly, yet its presence dominated every decision. Crew members reported an almost instinctive dread, the constant worry that a miscalculated move could lead to disaster. Trust in their own vessel was eroded. Every creak of the hull, every bubble escaping the ballast tanks, became a potential signal to an unseen adversary. By the end of 1941, the Kriegsmarine recognized that sonar was a strategic game-changer. The Atlantic, once a realm of German dominance, had become a landscape of uncertainty. Submarine crews had to operate under the constant knowledge that they were visible to an enemy they could not see, hunted by a technology that rendered stealth obsolete. The metallic ping that began as a curious anomaly was now understood as the beginning of a technological revolution, one that would force Germany to rethink underwater warfare forever. The first encounters with sonar were not just tactical challenges. They were a psychological awakening. The hunter had become visible, and the hunter was no longer at sea. It was in the echo, in the pulse, and in every vibration of the ocean that a U-boat had once called home. The crushing weight of invisible pressure by early 1942, sonar had become a consistent threat across the Atlantic, and the psychological toll on U-boat crews was mounting. The metallic pings, once rare anomalies, had become routine, haunting every mission. For the submariners, the ocean that had once been their sanctuary was now a cage. Every sound within the hull was scrutinized. Every decision weighed with deadly consequence, and every movement risked exposure. On board U-123, stationed near the Bay of Biscay, Lieutenant Otto Reinhardt observed his crew's subtle but unmistakable signs of stress. Men who had once joked in the cramped mess hall now moved silently, their eyes flicking toward every gauge and bulkhead. The pressure wasn't merely physical. The submariners were dealing with a weight they could not see. Every ping was a reminder. The Allies were listening, hunting, always one step ahead. Even the rhythm of the engine became a source of anxiety. A perfectly timed change of speed or depth could mean survival, but a miscalculation might ensure death. The challenge was compounded by the inherent isolation of the submarine. Cut off from the world above the waves, with no immediate reinforcements, crews were forced to rely on instinct, training, and the imperfect instruments at their disposal. Orders were given in terse, clipped tones. Yet no matter how carefully executed, the echoing sonar pulses made every maneuver feel inadequate. Depth charges from unseen destroyers struck with terrifying unpredictability, and crews came to understand that stealth alone no longer guaranteed safety. The Allied sonar threat also forced tactical changes that were both physically and mentally exhausting. Submarines were ordered to dive deeper, maneuver more erratically, and limit radio transmissions. These precautions meant long hours in pitch-black, claustrophobic conditions, often with rising internal temperatures and dwindling air quality. Men developed headaches, nausea, and the first signs of what officers would later describe as sonar fatigue. The combination of physical strain and psychological terror began to erode confidence in both vessel and mission. Yet the most insidious effect was the realization that the ocean itself could betray them. Every creak, every bubble, every faint mechanical hum could now be interpreted as a signature detectable by the enemy. The deep, once a realm of freedom and control, became a place of constant vulnerability. Crews were aware that the Allies could anticipate movements, calculate positions, and launch attacks from seemingly impossible distances. They had been masters of stealth for 3 years. Now, they were being hunted by an invisible adversary who never slept, never blinked, and never revealed itself. By mid-1942, the Kriegsmarine Command recognized that the psychological burden on crews was as dangerous as any physical threat. Sonar had transformed submarine warfare from a contest of skill and daring into a high-stakes battle against fear itself. The Atlantic was no longer a hunting ground. It was a proving ground for survival under the suffocating pressure of constant observation. The metallic ping that had first struck U-557 was now a symbol, a relentless reminder that beneath the waves, invisibility was a myth, and every U-boat was vulnerable. This realization would shape every mission, every tactic, and every decision for the remainder of the Battle of the Atlantic. The submarine crews had to adapt or be destroyed. The first true losses, when theory met reality. By late 1942, the grim reality of sonar's impact became unavoidable. German U-boat crews, who had once prowled the Atlantic with impunity, were now learning the hard way that the Allies had found a way to make the invisible visible. The first catastrophic losses were not due to recklessness nor poor seamanship, but to a new, unseen enemy that made every movement, every dive, and every attempt at stealth predictable. U-201, commanded by Korvettenkapitän Adalbert Schultz, became one of the first submarines to fall victim to this technological revolution. The patrol began like any other. The crew was confident, experienced, and fully equipped. The Atlantic stretched endlessly around them, a dark and seemingly safe expanse. Then, in the dead of night, the echoing ping returned, precise and deliberate. The sonar pulses tracked the U-boat's every motion. The crew reacted instinctively, diving deeper and initiating evasive maneuvers. Yet the invisible net of detection had already closed around them. Depth charges rumbled through the water, each explosion rattling the hull, sending metal groaning and shaking crew members violently against the confined walls. Inside the submarine, panic mingled with trained discipline. Officers shouted orders over the cacophony of vibrations and alarms. Torpedoes had already been fired at convoy targets, but with the crew now on the defensive, their effectiveness was diminished. Every moment beneath the waves was measured in terror. Crewmen held their breaths, counting seconds as the sonar pulses drew ever closer, guiding Allied destroyers like a beacon to their precise location. No evasive maneuver could escape the technology. No skill could counter the invisible opponent that now dominated the Atlantic. Losses mounted quickly. By early 1943, reports detailed U-boats disappearing in previously safe patrol zones. Commanders in Berlin faced a sobering truth. The sonar revolution had fundamentally changed naval warfare. Submarines that had been designed to strike suddenly found themselves hunted, with their primary advantage, invisibility, gone. The psychological toll mirrored the physical losses. Morale plummeted, fear of the unseen became a constant companion, and every mission became a perilous gamble. The impact extended beyond individual vessels. The once feared U-boat fleet, considered a cornerstone of Germany's naval strategy, had to rethink tactics entirely. Surface attacks, previously a standard maneuver at night, became nearly suicidal. Crews were forced into deeper, longer dives with fewer opportunities to recharge batteries or ventilate the vessel. Communication restrictions compounded the problem, leaving officers to make rapid, high-stakes decisions with limited information. This first wave of losses taught a brutal lesson. Sonar was not a minor inconvenience or an experimental tool. It was a game-changing weapon, transforming the Atlantic from a hunting ground into a gauntlet. U-boat crews were now prey rather than predators, operating under the constant knowledge that the Allies could see them, even when the ocean itself seemed to provide cover. For the Kriegsmarine, the writing was clear. The tactics of the past would no longer suffice. Adaptation was urgent, but even as engineers experimented with countermeasures and evasive techniques, the Atlantic had already become a battlefield dominated by invisible eyes, forever altering the course of the submarine war. The metallic ping, once a curiosity, had become the harbinger of death, the sound of inevitability for any U-boat daring to traverse the Atlantic. The Allies' invisible web, expanding sonar dominance by early 1943, the Allies had fully recognized the strategic potential of sonar technology, and their anti-submarine campaigns began to evolve into a well-coordinated, relentless offensive. Convoys were no longer just protected by a handful of escort ships. Sonar-equipped destroyers, corvettes, and long-range patrol aircraft now formed an invisible net across the Atlantic, capable of detecting submarines that had once moved freely beneath the waves. For German U-boat crews, the ocean had become a surveillance grid, every meter monitored by unseen adversaries. On a cold, overcast morning near the Azores, U-575 sailed submerged, scanning the surface for convoy targets. The crew was tense but experienced, trusting in their training and the perceived invisibility of their steel vessel. Suddenly, a low metallic ping echoed through the hull. Lieutenant Friedrich Bauer immediately recognized the pattern: sonar. The vessel's location had been pinpointed with frightening precision. The captain ordered a rapid dive, but it was too late. Nearby Allied destroyers had already triangulated their position. Depth charges exploded in series, sending shockwaves through the submarine, buckling bulkheads and throwing crewmen against steel walls. The impact of these encounters went far beyond individual losses. German commanders began noticing patterns in the sonar strikes. Some submarines were attacked repeatedly in the same patrol zones, while others vanished without a trace. The technology allowed the Allies to coordinate attacks across hundreds of miles of ocean, effectively limiting the operational freedom of German subs. Each ping carried more than just sound. It carried information, positioning, movement, and vulnerability. Submarines that once felt like masters of stealth now had to assume that every maneuver, even minor course adjustments, was being monitored. The psychological strain on the crews was immense. For weeks on end, submariners operated in near-total darkness, listening for subtle echoes that might betray enemy presence. Sleep was intermittent, and fear became a constant companion. Decisions had to be made under extreme pressure, with knowledge that even a small mistake could trigger detection. Officers were forced to implement evasive tactics such as silent running, zigzag courses, and irregular depth changes, but the Allies adapted quickly. Sonar operators grew skilled at anticipating these maneuvers, keeping the submarines on the defensive. Kriegsmarine strategists realized that technological adaptation alone would not suffice. The traditional doctrine of U-boat warfare, aggressive attacks on convoys, reliance on stealth, and confidence in the ocean's protection, was no longer viable. Submarines were increasingly being forced into reactive maneuvers, abandoning offensive operations in favor of survival. Every patrol became a calculated exercise in risk management, and the once proud hunters of the Atlantic were now preyed upon by an invisible, methodical enemy. By mid-1943, the effectiveness of sonar had begun to shift the tide of the Battle of the Atlantic. U-boat losses climbed, supply routes were increasingly protected, and the German Naval Command faced the daunting challenge of countering a technology that rendered invisibility obsolete. The metallic ping had become not just a signal of detection, but a symbol of a new reality. Beneath the waves, the Allies now had eyes, and every U-boat operation was conducted under the unrelenting gaze of an invisible adversary. The Atlantic was no longer a domain of freedom. It was a calculated, perilous battlefield where survival depended on ingenuity, timing, and hope. Hope that sonar would not find them before the next depth charge did. Adaptation and desperation. German countermeasures by mid-1943. The German Kriegsmarine understood that the age of invisibility beneath the waves was over. Sonar technology had changed the rules of submarine warfare, turning the once powerful U-boat fleet into vulnerable prey. German commanders scrambled to adapt, implementing new tactics, retrofitting vessels with experimental equipment, and retraining crews to survive in an environment dominated by invisible detection. Yet each innovation was a race against time, as the Allies continued refining their sonar capabilities. U-571, under the command of Captain Lieutenant Günther Prien, became a testing ground for these desperate countermeasures. The crew, once confident in their stealth, now lived under constant stress, constantly monitoring sonar gauges, listening for even the faintest pulse. They experimented with erratic diving patterns, alternating depths and speeds in attempts to confuse sonar operators. Crew members were trained to minimize internal noise, shutting down non-essential machinery, muffling tools, and moving cautiously within the hull. Even the simplest tasks became exercises in discipline, as a single metallic click could betray the submarine's position to the enemy. At the same time, engineers introduced primitive sound-dampening modifications, wrapping engines and propeller shafts in rubber and experimenting with hull coatings to reduce the acoustic signature. These innovations, while promising in theory, often hampered performance and required crews to adjust quickly to new operational limitations. For many submariners, these changes underscored the severity of their predicament. The ocean they had once ruled was no longer theirs to control. Despite these efforts, the Allies continued to maintain the upper hand. Convoys now moved with layered sonar coverage, supported by long-range aircraft and fast-moving escort vessels. The ocean became a grid of detection, and any attempt at offensive operations carried immense risk. U-boat attacks grew fewer, as commanders weighed the dangers of exposure against the potential rewards of sinking Allied ships. Even veteran crews found themselves on the defensive, prioritizing survival over aggression. Psychologically, the shift was devastating. Men who had once approached their missions with confidence now operated under the constant fear of detection. Stress levels soared, sleep became sporadic, and morale plummeted. Officers struggled to maintain discipline and focus, aware that any lapse could be fatal. The metallic ping, once an unusual sound, had become a symbol of omnipresent threat, echoing through the submarine like a reminder that stealth was no longer enough. By late 1943, the Kriegsmarine had implemented formalized anti-sonar tactics across its fleet. Standard procedures included silent running, depth variation, and minimal surface time. However, these measures came at a cost. Slower speeds, reduced maneuverability, and increased fatigue for crews forced to endure longer missions in cramped oxygen-limited conditions. The balance between evasion and operational effectiveness became a delicate life-or-death equation. Ultimately, the struggle to adapt highlighted a fundamental truth of submarine warfare. Technology, once mastered by one side, could be turned against them with devastating efficiency. The Allies' sonar network had transformed the Atlantic from a domain of German dominance into a dangerous gauntlet. For the submariners, survival depended not only on skill and courage, but on the ability to navigate an invisible web of detection, where each metallic ping could herald disaster. The relentless pressure of sonar forced the German U-boat fleet to evolve quickly, but no adaptation could fully restore the freedom that had once defined life beneath the waves. The hunters had become hunted, and the Atlantic would never again belong to them. Silent running, life under constant threat. By 1944, the Battle of the Atlantic had entered a new, grueling phase. German U-boat crews were no longer the unseen predators of the deep. They were now prey, forced to operate under the omnipresent surveillance of Allied sonar. The technology had matured, and Allied operators had become highly skilled at interpreting every pulse, every echo, every subtle movement beneath the waves. For submariners, the once familiar rhythms of life aboard a U-boat had transformed into an ongoing battle against both detection and fear. U-62, patrolling near the North Sea, exemplified this new reality. The crew was seasoned, accustomed to the dangers of depth charges and aerial attacks. Yet sonar had introduced an intangible, insidious terror. Every metallic ping that reverberated through the hull was a reminder of their vulnerability, a ghostly signal that the Allies were watching and waiting. Officers ordered silent running, shutting down engines, ceasing non-essential operations, and minimizing noise throughout the submarine. Even routine movements became a coordinated effort, each man carefully calculating the risk of every step, every tool, every word spoken. The psychological strain was relentless. Sleep was short and fractured. punctuated by tense shifts of listening for sonar pings. Food and water rations were rationed not just for logistical reasons, but to limit unnecessary activity that could generate noise. Men became hypersensitive to the vibrations of the vessel, interpreting every creak of metal, every bubble rising through the ballast tanks as potential detection. The sense of isolation deepened, as radio silence and extreme caution removed the possibility of contact with other U-boats or command. Each mission felt like navigating a minefield in complete darkness. Despite the precautions, survival was never guaranteed. Allied destroyers used sonar to guide precision depth charge attacks, forcing U-boats to make high-stakes decisions in real time. Even minor miscalculations in depth, speed, or heading could lead to catastrophic damage. Submariners learned to expect the unexpected, constantly adapting to new sonar tactics, evasive patterns, and technological innovations deployed by the Allies. Each engagement became a deadly chess match, where the smallest mistake could have fatal consequences. The introduction of new countermeasures offered some hope, but these solutions were imperfect. Sound-dampening hull modifications and irregular diving routines provided limited relief, but often reduced the vessel's speed, agility, and combat effectiveness. Crews had to operate in tighter confines, endure longer periods underwater, and perform critical tasks with minimal noise, all while managing the fear that a single ping could seal their fate. By mid-1944, the cumulative effect of constant sonar surveillance was evident. German Naval Command noticed increased fatigue, declining morale, and heightened stress-related incidents among crews. Submarines were losing efficiency, offensive operations became riskier, and the very concept of underwater dominance had been eroded. The ocean, once a shield, had become a hunting ground under invisible eyes, and the U-boat fleet was forced to adapt to survive in a world where stealth was no longer a guarantee. Ultimately, life aboard a U-boat had become a relentless test of endurance, skill, and nerve. The metallic ping was no longer just a sound. It was a constant companion, a symbol of unseen danger, and a reminder that the ocean, once the domain of the hunters, had been irrevocably claimed by the Allies. Every dive, every maneuver, every mission carried the weight of this invisible threat, shaping the psychology, tactics, and fate of the German submarine fleet. The end of illusions, U-boats on the defensive. By late 1944, the reality of the sonar-dominated Atlantic was undeniable. German U-boat crews, once proud hunters of the seas, were now operating on borrowed time. The ocean had transformed from a realm of freedom into a lethal grid, where the invisible pulse of Allied sonar dictated every maneuver, every decision, and every heartbeat. Survival depended less on offensive skill and more on the ability to anticipate, evade, and endure under relentless pressure. 864, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Rolf Schauenberg, embarked on a critical mission to transport essential technology to Japan. The crew was seasoned, highly trained, and fully aware of the risks, yet nothing could erase the psychological weight of constant sonar detection. Every ping reverberating through the hull served as a warning. The Allies were not only watching, but actively hunting. The submarine was no longer in control of its environment. It was at the mercy of an invisible network of observers spread across hundreds of miles of ocean. The crew relied on every countermeasure at their disposal. Silent running, erratic depth changes, and careful speed management. Even mundane operations became exercises in extreme caution. Maintenance work, movement between compartments, and communication were all calculated to minimize acoustic signatures. The human cost was steep. Men suffered from sleep deprivation, chronic fatigue, and a pervasive sense of dread. The tension in the vessel was palpable, as if the submarine itself held its breath, waiting for the inevitable. Allied forces, skilled in sonar tracking and coordinated attack strategies, exploited this psychological and tactical advantage. Long-range aircraft provided continuous reconnaissance, and destroyer groups patrolled convoy routes with precision-guided sonar sweeps. Even when U-boats attempted aggressive maneuvers, the Allies anticipated patterns, forcing the submarines into defensive postures. Any offensive action became a calculated risk, and the margin for error had shrunk to almost nothing. The loss statistics reflected the severity of the threat. Submarines that had once been considered nearly invincible under the waves now disappeared with alarming regularity. Entire crews were lost without a trace, their fates sealed by sonar-guided depth charges before they could mount a defense. Commanders were forced to reconsider operational doctrine, prioritizing survival and evasion over mission objectives. Offensive patrols were limited, convoy attacks became cautious, and the sense of invincibility that had defined the early years of the U-boat campaign was irrevocably shattered. The psychological impact was profound. Crews became hyper-aware of every vibration, every echo, every bubble escaping the ballast tanks. Trust in the vessel, once implicit, was undermined by the awareness that even small sounds could betray them. Officers struggled to maintain morale as fear became an omnipresent companion, influencing decisions and shaping the very fabric of life aboard the submarine. The once confident hunters now moved with stealth and caution, constantly reacting to a threat they could not see. By the end of 1944, the Kriegsmarine faced a stark reality. Sonar had fundamentally altered submarine warfare. The U-boat fleet was no longer the master of the Atlantic. It was a hunted force, navigating a vast battlefield dominated by an invisible enemy. The metallic ping that had first struck U-557 in 1941 had evolved from an anomaly into a symbol of dominance, marking the end of the era in which submarines could operate freely beneath the waves. The Atlantic had been claimed by the Allies, not through sheer numbers or firepower alone, but through the invisible eyes of sonar. For German crews, the lesson was bitterly clear. Stealth, courage, and experience were no longer enough. The oceans belonged to those who could see the unseen, and beneath the waves, the hunters had become the hunted. The final reckoning. Lessons from the depths by early 1945. The era of unchallenged U-boat dominance had ended. German submarine crews, once feared throughout the Atlantic, now operated under constant surveillance and deadly pressure. Sonar technology had irrevocably changed the rules of naval warfare, transforming the oceans into a calculated and hazardous battlefield. The metallic pings that had first unnerved U-557 were now omnipresent, guiding Allied destroyers and aircraft with terrifying precision. Crews adapted as best they could, using silent running, erratic depth changes, and sound-dampening modifications. Yet no countermeasure could fully restore the freedom they once enjoyed. Every dive, every maneuver, every decision carried immense risk. Submariners faced not only physical danger from depth charges and torpedoes, but also psychological strain, operating in darkness, isolation, and near constant fear. The ocean was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a trap from which only a few would emerge unscathed. The lessons of this period were clear and unforgiving. Technology could overturn centuries of naval tradition. Stealth and skill were no longer guarantees of survival. The Allies' mastery of sonar not only saved countless lives and ships, but also reshaped the strategic landscape of the Atlantic. German U-boats were relegated to defensive roles, forced to retreat, evade, and survive rather than hunt. By war's end, the story of the U-boat crews was one of courage, resilience, and tragic loss. They had faced an invisible enemy that could see every move, hear every sound, and strike with deadly accuracy. The Battle of the Atlantic had been won not solely by firepower, but by innovation and the unrelenting application of new technology. The metallic ping, once a simple sound, had become the harbinger of change, marking the definitive end of the U-boat's reign beneath the waves, and proving that in modern warfare, invisibility is never guaranteed.